He thought she was lost forever, a little girl left to suffer in the merciless desert. 3 years later, while searching for his cattle, a seasoned rancher stumbles upon a child tied to a cross, alive but broken in ways no one could imagine. What he uncovers is not just a rescue, but a chilling secret of a ruthless cult hiding behind the mask of faith. This is a story of survival, faith twisted into cruelty, and a fight against darkness that threatens to consume them all. Tell us where you're watching this video in the comments below, and if these stories move you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, sit back and dive into this unforgettable journey. The desert was merciless that morning. The sun was still low, but already its heat bent the horizon into a shimmering mirage. I'd been tracking my cattle for nearly 3 hours, following hoofprints and the occasional broken brush where they'd passed. The land was barren, stretching endlessly, and the wind carried nothing but dust and silence, except for the occasional cry of a coyote far off. I never expected to find what I did. There, almost hidden beneath a scraggly mesquite tree, stood a wooden cross. It wasn't small. No, it must have been nearly 10 feet tall, and it looked out of place, planted deep into the cracked earth like a grim monument. I slowed my horse, squinting against the sun, trying to make sense of the figure tied to it. A girl. Not more than 12 years old, her wrists bound tightly with rough rope that had cut into her skin, her clothes torn and dirt-streaked. Her face was pale, streaked with tears and grime, and around her neck hung a wooden sign. I didn't want to read it, but I had to. Return when you're perfect. My heart dropped. This wasn't some random cruelty. It was something else entirely. Something worse. I'd seen bad things before. Indian raids, outlaw gangs, the kind of men who'd turn on their own kin for a bottle or a quick dollar. But this was deliberate, calculated, and it was wrapped in the guise of righteousness. I urged my horse forward, careful not to spook the poor girl. Her eyes met mine, wide with terror but also a flicker of hope. She was alive. That much was clear, though the cracked lips and trembling body told me she'd been here for hours, maybe longer. I dismounted with a quiet, "Easy now," trying to keep my voice soft. My hands shook as I pulled my knife, cutting the ropes that bit into her wrists. The moment they fell away, she collapsed against me like a broken doll, all bones and fear. I wrapped my coat around her, feeling the shivers ripple through her thin frame. "Who did this to you?" I whispered, but she didn't answer. Her throat looked raw, like she'd screamed herself hoarse. Around us, the desert wind swept away any fresh tracks, but there were wagon marks leading east, toward the jagged peaks of the Devil's Canyon. Whoever left her here had long disappeared. I carried her to my horse and mounted slowly, every muscle tense. The girl didn't say a word, but when I looked down at her, she was clutching something small and white, a carved piece of bone shaped like a lamb. On it, faint letters were burned into the surface. "The pure shall inherit." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just cruelty. It was something twisted, something born of faith turned foul. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, except for the soft, ragged breaths she took beside me. My mind raced. Who would do this? And why? The house sat nestled in a valley surrounded by red canyon walls, a place that had always been my refuge from the desert's harshness. But that sanctuary shattered the moment I stepped inside carrying her. She wasn't just hurt. She was broken. Physically, yes, but deeper wounds ran beneath the surface. I sat her down in the kitchen chair, but she immediately curled into herself like a frightened animal, eyes darting to every shadow, every window. I went to the pump to fetch water, but when I turned back, she'd pressed herself against the wall, trembling. The tin cup I handed her was gripped tightly with both hands. Her fingers showed small, deliberate scars, too precise to be accidents. Whoever had done this had been methodical, systematic. I asked her name, but no sound came. She touched her throat and winced, shaking her head. I realized then that whatever they had done had stolen her voice. I knelt beside her, careful not to frighten her more. She didn't have to talk, but I needed to know if someone was still after her. Tears filled her eyes as she pointed toward the mountains where the wagon tracks led, then held up 5 fingers, twice. 5 children. She shook her head to deny that number, then pointed at herself and held up 5 fingers again. 5 children, including her. The weight of that truth settled on my chest like a stone. They weren't alone. There were others. And if she had been left tied to a cross in the desert, what horrors awaited the rest? I moved to the window, scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly, hiding secrets I was just beginning to understand. Someone was collecting children, torturing them. Maybe worse. She showed me the bone carving again, turning it over in her hands. The craftsmanship was too fine for an outlaw gang, too deliberate for madmen. This was organized, methodical, religious fanatics. They believed God was on their side. I studied her haunted eyes and the carved lamb in her hand. She was the first, number 1. 30 days. She'd been with them a month. I climbed onto the roof and took out my spyglass, searching the mountains eastward. There, smoke rose thin and gray from behind a red mesa about 5 miles away. Someone was camped there. Not a few men, but a group large enough to send out riders. Back inside, she pointed to a wanted poster pinned on my wall for months, a face I knew well. Ezekiel Morse. A preacher run out of 3 territories for strange practices with children. She nodded vigorously. She knew him. He had her. And he had the other children too. The pieces fell into place. Ezekiel Morse wasn't just a preacher. He was a predator who used religion as a mask for his crimes. The bone carving, the cross, the talk of perfection, it was all part of his twisted gospel. He had the other children up in those mountains. And now, he was coming for the girl. I didn't have much time. The day was fading fast when I heard the distant thrum of hooves pounding against the cracked earth. My heart sank, a cold weight settling deep in my gut. The shadows of the canyon lengthened, swallowing the desert light as the riders drew closer. I knew without looking that it was them, the men of Ezekiel Morse, come to claim what they believed was theirs. I didn't have time to hesitate. The girl, fragile and trembling, darted behind the heavy oak table in the kitchen, eyes wide with terror. She knew those sounds, she had lived through them before. And now they were here. I grabbed my Winchester, feeling the familiar weight settle into my hands, the cold steel a stark contrast to the burning fear in my chest. I moved to the window, peering through the dust-streaked glass. At least 6 riders, dressed in black, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats, approached in a formation that spoke of purpose and danger. At their head was a tall man with a white beard, carrying a wooden staff topped with the very same carved lamb I'd seen on the bone pendant. Ezekiel Morse himself. His voice cut through the dry air, cold and commanding as he called out, "Brother Morrison, the Lord has led us to your door in search of one of his lost lambs." I stepped onto the porch, Winchester held loose but ready. Behind me, I could hear the girl's ragged breathing, her presence a sharp reminder of what was at stake. "I don't see any lost livestock here, preacher," I replied, voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "Might want to check with the Mexicans down south, they're always losing sheep." His smile was thin, cruel, like a blade hidden beneath a velvet glove. "The lamb we seek walks on 2 legs, he said, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "A child pure of heart but tainted by sin. She was placed upon the cross of redemption this morning to contemplate her wickedness." I felt a surge of anger, my grip tightening on the rifle. These weren't men of God, they were monsters cloaked in sanctimony. From inside the house came a soft sound, the girl's voice, trembling but defiant. "She questioned the word of God," Ezekiel said, eyes narrowing. "Such pride must be purged before it infects the others." I was done talking. My finger found the trigger, but Morse raised his staff, a silent command to his men to hold their fire. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. "Brother Morrison, the tracks of your horse lead directly from our place of prayer to your ranch," Morse said, studying me like a predator sizing up prey. "You have made a grave error in judgment." The riders shifted, hands drifting toward holsters, but the preacher's raised staff stayed their draw. "You speak of violence, brother, but we are men of peace. We seek only to return a lost child to her family. I laughed, bitter and cold. Her family? You mean the 4 other children chained up in those mountains? What kind of family keeps their kids in chains? Morse's calm cracked just enough to reveal the monster beneath. The children under my care are being prepared for God's kingdom. What you call chains, I call salvation. I knew then there would be no reasoning with them. The girl whimpered from inside the house, and my heart clenched. They'd forced her to pray to the same God they claimed to serve while they tortured her. No more praying to their God, little one, I whispered as I helped her to her feet. We're going to stop them. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of hooves coming fast from the east. More riders. Panic flashed in the girl's eyes as she hid behind the table, trembling like a scared animal. They'd been found. I took a breath, bracing myself. 6 riders emerged from the dust, all dressed like undertakers in black. At their head, Morse sat tall in his saddle, his white beard flowing over his coat like spilled milk, his eyes cold as winter ice. Return the child, Morse called out, voice echoing across the yard, or face the consequences of defying God's will. I stepped forward, rifle ready but steady. No children here but rattlesnakes and buzzards, I said, my voice carrying the weight of desert justice. Seems like you fit right in. Morse's men tensed, hands twitching toward weapons, but the preacher raised his staff again, holding them back. You cannot hide the truth, Brother Morrison, he said, eyes glittering with fanatic fire. God's will be done. The 2 men at the well dismounted to water their horses, unaware of the trap laid for them. I counted steps and angles, the desert wind playing tricks, the sun dipping low. Every second mattered. Then, without warning, I fired. The first bullet found Brother Thomas before he could reach his holster. He dropped like a sack of grain, dust rising where he fell. From inside the house, the sound of breaking glass shattered the tension. The girl was escaping through the back window. Get the child! Morse barked, fury twisting his features. Brother Samuel and Brother Joshua charged toward the rear, guns drawn. I rolled to the left, firing as I moved. Samuel took a shot to the shoulder but kept crawling toward cover. Joshua tried to intercept the girl. She struggled up the rocky slope behind the house, her small form silhouetted against the dying light. Joshua's hat flew off as my bullet whistled past his head. But more riders appeared, at least 4 more, emerging from the canyon trail. The odds were against me, but I knew every inch of this land. Years of fighting Apache and Comanche raids had taught me patience and cunning. I crawled to an old depression I'd dug during a raid long ago, a shallow trench hidden by brush and rock. From there, I had a clear line of sight to both flanks. The girl reached the ledges but was weak, slipping on the loose stones. Joshua lunged, gun raised. I fired again, and he fell back. The preacher's voice rang out over the chaos. You cannot protect her forever, he sneered. More men are coming. My chest burned with pain, but I gritted my teeth. Then I heard a cry, a child's cry of pain that cut through the gunfire. She'd fallen. I dropped my cover and ran toward the canyon, every shot aimed at me. The first bullet caught my left shoulder, spinning me around. The second grazed past. I reached the girl just as Joshua raised his pistol. I threw myself between them, taking the bullet in the chest. The world spun, blood flooding my senses, but I was alive. The girl knelt beside me, pressing her hands to my wound. For the first time, she spoke. Thank you. But there was no time for rest. Joshua stood over us, pistol aimed at my head. Suddenly, the thunder of more horses filled the air. A cavalry patrol thundered in from the south, their carbines raised. Lieutenant Hayes led them, 12 soldiers ready for battle. Ezekiel Morse, Hayes called, voice clear and commanding. You're under arrest for kidnapping, child endangerment, and murder. Drop your weapons. Morse's face went pale. His carefully planned operation had become a trap. He raised his staff like a weapon, eyes burning with desperate fury. "You cannot stop God's work," he screamed. "These children belong to the Lord." "The only place you're going is prison," Hayes replied, steady as a rock. Brother Joshua made a fatal mistake, swinging his pistol at the soldiers. Hayes fired, a clean shot between the eyes. The remaining fanatics surrendered, dropping their weapons and raising their hands. Without their leader, their fanaticism crumbled. Hayes knelt beside me. "How bad is it, rancher?" he asked. I coughed, tasting blood. "I'll live. But there are more children up in Devil's Canyon." The girl nodded, pointing toward the mountains, holding up 4 fingers. Hayes understood. "Sergeant Wilson, take half the men and search the canyons. Find those children." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, I watched the cavalry ride toward the mountains. The girl sat beside me, no longer trembling. She'd found her voice, and her courage. Hours later, Sergeant Wilson returned with 4 children. 3 girls and a boy. Thin, scared, but alive. When they saw their friend safe beside me, tears flowed freely. Ezekiel Morse and his followers faced justice. They would hang within the month. The girl, whose name was Sarah, stayed with me. She helped me recover. I helped her find laughter again. 6 months later, when the circuit judge came through, we made it official. Sometimes, the desert gives back more than it takes away. The desert night wrapped itself around the ranch like a suffocating blanket. The once blazing sun had surrendered to a cold, unforgiving darkness. The stars blinked overhead, distant and indifferent. I lay on my cot, the pain from the bullet wound throbbing in my chest, but it wasn't just the physical agony that kept me awake. It was the weight of what I'd uncovered, the twisted horror lurking just beyond those red canyon walls. Sarah sat quietly beside me, her small hand barely brushing mine, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace. She'd come a long way from the frightened, broken girl I'd found tied to that cursed cross. But even now, there was a haunted look in her eyes that no comfort could erase. I had to know everything. I needed to understand the true scope of what Ezekiel Morse and his fanatics had done. And if there was any chance of saving the other children, time was slipping through my fingers like desert sand. Days passed in a blur of slow recovery and whispered confessions. Sarah couldn't speak. Not yet, but she had her ways. With painstaking patience, I learned to read her signs and symbols. The carved bone lamb wasn't just a trinket, it was a message. Each child taken was marked with 1. 5 in total. 5 children trapped in this nightmare. She told me about the mountain hideout, Devil's Canyon, the twisting labyrinth of rocks and caves where the cult held their prayers and punishments. She described the rituals, the prayers forced on them, the pain masked as salvation. And worst of all, the way Morse used scripture twisted to justify his cruelty. I could see the scars on her skin, each one a story she could never tell aloud. The ranch became our fortress. I fortified the place, repairing old fences, hiding weapons, preparing for the inevitable return of Morse's followers. But the nightmare was far from over. One night, the sound of hooves shattered the silence again. This time, it wasn't the preacher's men, it was the cavalry patrol, led by Lieutenant Hayes. They'd brought back the other children, thin and frightened, but alive. Their faces told the story better than words ever could. Years of torment etched into their eyes, but flickers of hope kindling beneath. Sarah took to caring for them, her voice growing stronger each day. I watched as the group began to heal in fits and starts. But even as justice loomed over Morse and his followers, the darkness of what had happened hung heavy in the air. The trial was swift and brutal. Morse and his inner circle were found guilty on all counts: kidnapping, child abuse, and murder. They'd twisted faith into a weapon, and the law didn't tolerate such monsters. As they awaited their fate, the community rallied around the children, offering shelter and care. But for Sarah and me, the desert still whispered its harsh lessons. One afternoon, as the sun baked the valley, I found Sarah sitting on the porch, clutching the carved lamb bone. She looked up, her eyes steady. "I'm not just a survivor," I heard her say softly, her voice still rough but determined. "I'm a fighter." Those words echoed in my soul. The desert had tested us both, but we'd come out stronger. Our bond, forged in the fires of hell, had become unbreakable. Together, we faced the future. And sometimes, just sometimes, the desert gives back more than it takes away. The days following the trial were a strange kind of quiet. The desert sun still burned hot, but something intangible had shifted in the air. Justice had been served, yet the scars left behind by Ezekiel Morse and his twisted cult ran far deeper than anyone could see. For me, the ranch, once a place of hard work and solitude, had transformed into a sanctuary of healing, both for the children and for myself. Sarah was at the center of it all. The little girl who had once been bound and broken was slowly becoming a beacon of resilience. She helped the other children, guiding them through the nightmares that haunted their sleep, coaxing them toward light where there had been none. The days were filled with laughter and tears, a fragile dance between hope and pain. But as the sun rose each morning, casting its golden light over the Red Canyon walls, I knew the shadows of the past still lingered. One afternoon, as I was repairing a fence line, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon. My heart quickened. It wasn't the cavalry this time. A lone rider approached, dust swirling around him like a cloak. As he drew nearer, I recognized the worn, sun-baked face of Sergeant Wilson. He carried news I wasn't prepared to hear. "There's been talk," he said grimly, dismounting his horse. "Some folks believe Morse had more than just those men following him. That there's a network, others like him, spread out across the territory." I swallowed hard. It made sense. Organized cruelty like that rarely stayed contained. "More children, more towns," Wilson continued. "And not just in the desert. They say there's a compound out east, near the border, where they're doing worse things. Kidnapping, brainwashing, using faith as a weapon to control." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My jaw clenched. We couldn't let that happen. Not after what we'd been through. That night, as the stars blinked coldly overhead, I sat by the fire with Sarah. Her eyes reflected the flames, fierce and unyielding. "We can't let them hurt others," she whispered. I nodded. "We won't." The next morning, plans were made. Sergeant Wilson and I gathered a small group of trusted men, ranchers, former soldiers, anyone willing to stand against the darkness. We prepared to ride toward the rumored compound, to strike at the heart of the evil that had nearly destroyed us. Sarah insisted on coming with us. I wanted to say no, but her resolve was steel. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a warrior. The journey east was harsh. The terrain shifted from barren desert to rolling plains, and finally to scrubby foothills near the borderlands. We rode hard, following whispered leads and old trails that often disappeared into the dust. Every mile was a reminder of how far this nightmare reached. When we finally arrived, the compound was worse than I'd imagined, a sprawling fortress of stone and iron, hidden among twisted trees and barbed wire fences. The air smelled of fear and desperation. We watched from the shadows, noting patrol patterns, guards armed and ready. This was no simple outlaw camp. This was a twisted kingdom built on lies and suffering. Sarah's hand tightened around the carved lamb pendant at her neck, a symbol of defiance now. At night, we crept closer, the weight of what we might find pressing down on us. Children's cries echoed faintly on the wind, cutting through the darkness. We couldn't wait any longer. The assault began before dawn. Gunfire shattered the morning calm, echoes bouncing off the rocky hills. We moved fast and hard, taking the cultists by surprise. It was brutal, messy. Some of the men fell, but we fought like hell to save those children. Inside the compound, the evidence of horror was overwhelming. Cells lined with chains, worn prayer rugs stained with tears and blood, faces of children pale with hunger and fear. Sarah led the way to the heart of the compound, where a group of children sat huddled together, eyes wide with disbelief as we broke the locks. The youngest, no older than 6, clung to her sister with shaking hands. When Sarah knelt and spoke to them gently, the chains of fear began to fall away. We carried them out, one by one, into the blazing light of freedom. That day, the sun rose over a broken fortress. Justice wasn't just a word anymore, it was a promise. Back at the ranch, the children found refuge. Slowly, they began to heal, their laughter mingling with the wind. Sarah and I watched as hope grew, stubborn and fierce, like desert wildflowers pushing through cracked earth. We knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be darkness in the world. But together, we had become its reckoning. The days after the raid on the compound were a blur of activity and exhaustion. The children, new survivors of the darkness, were fragile like delicate desert blooms, wary of the sun and the winds. Their eyes told stories they couldn't speak, and their silence filled every corner of the ranch with a weight I couldn't ignore. Sarah, though young, took on a role I never expected. She became a guardian, a guide, the voice for those who had lost theirs. I watched her with a mixture of pride and awe, but also a gnawing worry. The burden she bore was heavier than any child should be. Each night, I lay awake with the phantom pains of my old wounds and the ghost of what we had seen etched behind my eyelids. The faces of those children haunted me, not as memories, but as calls to arms. The fight we had started was far from over. One evening, a traveler arrived at the ranch. An old man with weathered skin and eyes sharp as a hawk's. He introduced himself as Jeremiah, a man who had spent years tracking the movements of dark cults across the territories. He spoke softly but with urgency. There are whispers, he said, of other preachers, other fanatics, each with their own twisted vision. They're spreading, taking root in places no one dares to look. Jeremiah's words were a cold rain on an already parched land. He told us of secret meetings, coded messages carved into wood and bone, and of children taken as sacrifices to these so-called gods. I looked at Sarah and saw the fire in her eyes ignite anew. "We have to stop them," she said simply. We agreed. The ranch would become our base of operations, a sanctuary and a beacon for those fighting this hidden war. Jeremiah began training us in ways I never imagined I'd have to learn. Tracking, reconnaissance, even the grim art of interrogation. It wasn't just about brute force anymore. It was a battle of wits and shadows. Over the next months, our group grew. Survivors and fighters from towns near and far joined us. Each had stories of lost children, of families shattered by these cults cloaked in faith. Our missions took us into forgotten corners of the desert, to abandoned mining towns, and to mountain caves where light barely touched the stone. Each raid uncovered more horrors but also saved lives, innocents who had been trapped in these dark sanctuaries. Through it all, Sarah remained my anchor. Her strength, though born of pain, became a light for us all. One cold night, as the wind howled outside our cabin, Sarah pulled me aside. In her hand was a small, worn book, pages filled with symbols and prayers I couldn't understand. "I found this in the compound," she said. It belonged to Morse. It's not just prayers, it's a guide. A manual for control and punishment. Together, we pored over the pages by candlelight. The deeper we read, the clearer it became. These cults operated not only through faith but through fear and manipulation, twisting hope into despair. But the book also hinted at weaknesses, a way to disrupt their rituals and break their hold. Armed with this knowledge, our strikes became more targeted. We dismantled supply lines, intercepted messages, and freed children whose spirits had nearly been broken. The desert was still vast and harsh, but with every victory, the shadows shrank a little more. Yet, with each step forward, the cults grew more desperate and more dangerous. They began sending hunters after us, men twisted by fanaticism and madness, willing to kill to protect their dark empire. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, a band of these hunters rode into our camp. The attack was sudden and brutal, catching us off guard. Gunfire erupted, and chaos spilled across the open ground. I found myself back in that first battle, adrenaline and fear mingling as I fought to protect those who had become my family. Sarah was in the thick of it, her aim true, her voice steady as she rallied the others. By nightfall, we had repelled the attackers, but not without cost. Several of our fighters lay wounded, and the threat was now painfully real. These cultists would not surrender. As the dust settled, I looked at Sarah, her face streaked with dirt and resolve. "We've made them angry," I said. She nodded. But we've also made them afraid. In that moment, I knew the fight ahead would be the hardest yet. The desert had claimed many souls, but we were determined to be its salvation. Together, we would bring light to the darkest places, and no matter the cost, we would not back down. The desert wind carried a chill that night, sharper than the usual dry air that swept through the canyon walls. I lay awake, the weight of the past months pressing down like a stone in my chest. The battles we'd fought, the children we'd saved, it all felt like just the beginning of something much larger, a war that stretched far beyond the boundaries of my ranch. Sarah sat beside the fire, her eyes tracing the flickering flames, her hands folded around that worn lamb bone pendant, the symbol of the nightmare we'd escaped, but also the hope we clung to. She'd grown into her strength, but I could still see the traces of fear that lingered beneath her fierce exterior. Jeremiah's words echoed in my mind from our last council. The cults weren't isolated, they were networks spreading poison throughout the land. We were fighting shadows, and shadows had a habit of slipping through cracks, hiding in places you least expected. That night, we pored over maps and intercepted letters, planning our next move. Our informants had uncovered a new hideout, deep in the ruins of an abandoned mission several days' ride from the ranch. Rumor was, it was a central hub where children were brought for indoctrination and worse. The decision was unanimous. We couldn't wait for the darkness to come to us. We had to strike first. Days later, we set out at dawn, a band of weary but determined souls. The journey was long and unforgiving. The landscape changed as we rode. Cactus and scrub gave way to twisted mesquite and then to dry, cracked earth dotted with ancient stone walls. The mission lay in ruins, half swallowed by the desert, its cracked crosses leaning toward the sky like broken prayers. We approached cautiously. The air smelled of dust and rot. The ground bore the marks of many footsteps, some heavy with malice, some light with desperation. Inside, the mission was a labyrinth of shadows and silence. We found cells carved into the stone, some empty, others filled with the echoes of past horrors. There were chains rusted with time, torn scraps of cloth, and a faint scent of smoke from long cold fires. Then we heard it, a soft whimper from below, beneath a loose floorboard. We pried it open to reveal a narrow tunnel, damp and claustrophobic. The sounds grew louder, whispers of hope, of fear, of children. We followed the passage until it opened into a cavern, where half a dozen children huddled, eyes wide and wary. They were thin, pale as ghosts, but alive. Sarah stepped forward, her voice gentle yet firm. She spoke slowly, offering reassurance through soft words and warm smiles. The children clung to each other, trembling but beginning to believe. We freed them, leading them back through the twisting tunnels and into the blinding light of freedom. But as we prepared to leave, a shadow moved at the edge of the ruins, a figure draped in black, eyes burning with fanatic fire. The battle was swift and brutal. The cultists had been tipped off, waiting in the dark for our arrival. We fought for every step, every breath. Bullets tore through the dry air. The cries of the children spurred us onward. In the chaos, Sarah faced the shadowy figure, their eyes locking in a silent war. The figure's voice was a hiss, venomous with hate, promising retribution and damnation. But Sarah stood tall, unbroken. We fought our way out, dragging the children to safety, but not without loss. Some of our own fell that day, martyrs in a war few understood. Back at the ranch, the wounds were both visible and unseen. The children needed more than food and shelter, they needed healing, a chance to be children again. Sarah dedicated herself to their care, organizing games, telling stories of hope, and teaching them that faith should be a refuge, not a prison. I watched her grow into a leader, her spirit unyielding, even as the scars of the past lingered. But the cults were not finished. Their reach stretched farther, their methods more insidious. They whispered in the shadows, spreading doubt and fear. And somewhere, deep in the desert, Ezekiel Morse's legacy still cast its long, dark shadow. We knew this was far from over. But as the desert sun set, casting its warm glow over the ranch, I felt a flicker of something precious, hope. Together, we would face the darkness. And this time, we would bring the dawn. The days blurred into one another, the relentless sun carving deep lines in the earth and deeper shadows in our hearts. The ranch had become a fortress, a sanctuary for those who had lost everything to the cults that lurked like venomous serpents in the deserts and canyons. But peace was a fleeting dream, and every dawn brought a fresh wave of challenges. Sarah was no longer just the frightened girl I had found bound to that cruel cross. She was a warrior, a symbol of resilience and defiance. She moved through the ranch with purpose, tending to the children, organizing their days, her eyes always watching, always calculating. But the wounds ran deep. Every scar on their bodies was a story of pain and survival, and every silence screamed of the horrors they'd endured. Their nightmares often echoed through the quiet hours of the night, and the ranch became a place of whispered fears and fragile hopes. Jeremiah, the grizzled tracker who had joined our cause, spent hours training the men and women who had come from nearby towns. He taught us to read the desert, the subtle shifts in the wind, the faintest trails left behind by horses and wagons, the way shadows could betray even the most careful movements. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Red Canyon walls, Jeremiah approached me with a grim expression. "They're organizing again," he said quietly. "A network, larger than we thought. They've been communicating through coded messages, moving children from one place to another, keeping us guessing." His words weighed heavy on me. We had been fighting shadows, ghosts in the desert, but now those shadows were coalescing into something far more dangerous. We convened a council under the stars, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows across hardened faces. Sarah was there, her youthful determination a beacon amidst seasoned fighters. We needed to strike before the cult could regroup. The target was a remote settlement deep in the canyonlands, a place whispered about in fearful tones, known only as the Sanctuary. It was rumored to be the cult's newest stronghold, a fortress hidden among jagged rocks and ancient ruins. The plan was perilous. The terrain was treacherous, and the enemy was well-armed and fanatically loyal. But we had no choice. The children's lives depended on it. We set out at first light, our small band moving silently through the rugged landscape. The heat was brutal, and the canyon walls echoed with the cries of vultures circling overhead. Every step brought us closer to danger, but also to hope. As we neared the sanctuary, signs of the cult's presence became undeniable. Makeshift crosses planted in the ground, prayers scratched into rocks, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the dry air. We moved under cover of darkness, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the jagged cliffs. Inside the compound, the sight was worse than I imagined. Children huddled in cages, their eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. The cultists moved among them, chanting prayers that twisted faith into chains. Sarah was the first to reach the cages, her voice firm yet soothing as she called to the children, promising freedom, safety, and a future beyond these walls. The rescue turned into a battle. Gunfire shattered the night, and the cultists fought with desperate fury. We held our ground, protecting the children as we broke their chains and led them into the dark wilderness. But the sanctuary was a trap. As we fled through the narrow canyon paths, cult reinforcements blocked our escape. The sun was rising, turning the sky a blood-red hue that matched the rage in our hearts. We fought tooth and nail, every moment a struggle for survival. In the chaos, Sarah was cornered by a man wielding a cruel blade, a fanatic whose eyes burned with madness. Without hesitation, I threw myself between them, taking a wound meant for her. The pain was searing, but I held on, driven by the knowledge that these children needed us alive. We broke through the lines, riding hard until the canyon opened onto the plains where the cavalry awaited. Lieutenant Hayes and his soldiers rode out, their carbines ready, turning the tide of the battle. The cultists scattered, their twisted empire crumbling with each passing moment. Back at the ranch, the cost was clear. The wounds we bore, both seen and unseen, were reminders of the darkness we'd faced. But so was the light, the laughter of children rediscovering joy, the bond forged between survivors, the unyielding spirit of a young girl who refused to be broken. Sarah sat beside me as the sun set, the carved lamb bone resting in her palm. "We're not done," she said softly. "But we're getting closer." And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. Together, we would face whatever came next. The desert had taken much, but it had given us something precious, a chance to fight back. The days following our narrow escape from the sanctuary were heavy with exhaustion and grief, but the fire in our hearts refused to dim. The children, fragile but alive, clung to the fragile promise of safety we offered. Their quiet resilience inspired every step we took forward. Sarah had become the soul of our fight, her quiet courage turning the tide in moments when hope seemed lost. Watching her move among the children, comforting them with a touch or a word, I saw in her the strength that could never be broken. Yet the desert whispered warnings. Our enemies were no longer just isolated fanatics, they were a sprawling network of darkness. Jeremiah's intelligence revealed new horrors. Children sold, traded, and moved across vast territories, caught in a web that stretched like an endless desert horizon. One morning, a letter arrived, delivered by a stranger under cover of dawn. Its message was chilling, a challenge from the cult's shadowy leader, a threat that if we did not cease our interference, the lives of the children in our care would be forfeit. I read those words under the unforgiving sun, feeling the weight of every line. It was a call to war. We knew the cult's power wasn't only in numbers or weapons. It was in the fear they bred, the twisted faith that bound their followers to a cause that defied all reason. Sarah gathered the children and survivors beneath the wide sky. Her voice was steady as she told them that fear would not rule their lives. That together, we could break the chains, both physical and invisible. Our next mission was clear. Intelligence had led us to a remote town deep in the borderlands, a place called Red Mesa. There, whispers told of a cult compound where children were being held, hidden in plain sight under the guise of a religious community. The journey was grueling, the terrain rugged and unforgiving. Dust choked our throats, and the sun scorched the earth. But with every mile, our resolve hardened. Red Mesa was a town of faded hope, dusty streets lined with cracked adobe buildings, the people wary and tight-lipped. The cult's influence was palpable, wrapped in prayers and sermons that masked a brutal truth. We watched and waited, blending into the shadows as we gathered evidence and sought allies among the few who dared to oppose the cult's grip. One night, under a moonless sky, we struck. The raid was swift and merciless. We freed the children trapped behind locked doors and barred windows, their eyes shining with disbelief and fear. The cultists fought like cornered beasts, their fanaticism fueled by desperation. Bullets tore through the air, cries of defiance and pain mingling in the darkness. Sarah moved through the chaos like a beacon, leading the children to safety, her presence a steadying force amid the storm. But victory came at a cost. As dawn broke over the hills, we counted the toll, friends lost, wounds inflicted, and the knowledge that the enemy would never relent. Back at the ranch, the weight of our fight pressed down, but so did the determination to see it through. Sarah sat beside me one evening, the lamb bone pendant glinting in the fading light. "We've broken their chains, but they keep forging new ones," she said softly. I nodded, knowing the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril. Yet, beneath the endless desert sky, a fierce light burned in our hearts. We were no longer just survivors. We were a resistance. And the desert would remember our fight. The burning sun stretched mercilessly across the barren lands as we prepared for what felt like the most dangerous chapter of our fight. Red Mesa had shown us that the cult was not a scattered group of fanatics but a sprawling network with deep roots and insidious reach. They had powerful allies, secret hideouts, and a will to corrupt that seemed endless. The ranch had grown, a gathering place for those who refused to bow to the cult's twisted gospel. Farmers, former soldiers, and townsfolk had joined us, all driven by the same fierce desire to protect the innocent. Sarah was their heart, the unspoken promise of hope, even when the weight of her past threatened to consume her. In the quiet moments before dawn, I often found myself staring out across the desert horizon, wrestling with the toll this fight had taken. Each victory came at a price, and the scars, both visible and unseen, were mounting. One morning, Jeremiah returned from a scouting mission with grave news. He had uncovered the location of the cult's main sanctuary, a fortress carved into the cliffs of the Black Mesa, a place whispered about in fearful legends. It was there that the remaining children were held, their spirits broken but alive, awaiting an uncertain fate. The mission to infiltrate Black Mesa was fraught with peril. The terrain was hostile, the enemy vigilant and ruthless. We would be stepping into the lion's den, with little hope of backup or retreat. Sarah stood beside me as we laid plans, her eyes steady and resolute. "This is where we end it," she said. "For the children, for the lost souls still trapped in that hell." The journey was long and arduous. We rode under the cover of night, navigating narrow canyons and treacherous ledges. The air was thin, the silence oppressive. As we approached the cliffs, the sun began to rise, casting a blood-red glow over the stone fortress that loomed ahead. It was a place of shadows and secrets, where faith had been twisted into chains. We moved with calculated precision, avoiding patrols and traps as we closed in. The cries of children echoed faintly on the wind, a haunting reminder of the stakes. Inside the fortress, the horrors we found defied description. The children were kept in cells, their eyes hollow, their bodies marked by cruelty. The cultists moved with blind devotion, chanting prayers that echoed through the cold halls. Sarah led the rescue, her voice a lifeline to the broken souls as we shattered chains and tore down walls. The cultists fought with desperate fury, but we were fueled by a righteous fire. Gunfire echoed, steel clashed, and the air was thick with tension. In the chaos, I found myself face to face with the cult's leader, a man whose eyes burned with fanatic madness and whose words dripped with poison. "You cannot stop God's will," he hissed. But I saw through the mask. This was not faith, but corruption. We fought. The battle a clash of wills as much as weapons. When it was over, the fortress lay silent, the cult's grip shattered. The children were free, their spirits fragile but unbroken. As we rode back to the ranch, the desert seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The fight was not over, but a great evil had been vanquished. Sarah sat beside me, the lamb bone pendant resting against her chest, a symbol of survival and hope. "We've come so far," she whispered. "And we'll keep going," I replied. The desert had tested us, broken us, but it had also forged us anew. Together, we would face whatever darkness remained. For in this harsh land, even the smallest light could shine like a beacon. The night after our victory at Black Mesa, the stars above the desert felt unusually cold and distant, as if the heavens themselves were wary of the darkness we'd just torn apart. The air was heavy with a mix of relief and sorrow. We had saved the children, but the cost was etched deep in our bones. Friends lost, wounds both visible and invisible, and a reminder that even in victory, the scars linger. Sarah sat by the fire, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the carved lamb bone pendant, the emblem of the nightmare we'd overcome and the hope that kept us moving forward. Her eyes, once haunted by fear, now gleamed with a fierce determination that seemed to burn brighter each day. Around us, the ranch was a haven in the vast, unforgiving desert, a place where broken souls found refuge and where the whispers of past horrors were met with the roar of newfound strength. The children, though still fragile, began to rediscover laughter, play, and the simple joys of childhood. Their resilience was a testament to the indomitable human spirit. But even as we celebrated, the desert held its breath. The cult's remnants were scattered but not defeated. Rumors spread of other enclaves, smaller cells that had slipped through our grasp, still operating in the shadows. Their twisted faith remained a poison, infecting the weak and desperate. One morning, a messenger arrived with a cryptic warning. Ezekiel Morse's closest confidants were regrouping. They sought to revive the cult's power, rallying under a new banner, more secretive and deadly than before. They had changed tactics, weaving deeper into towns and communities, their influence harder to track. Jeremiah and I gathered the council beneath the scorching sun, our faces shaded by wide-brimmed hats, eyes squinting against the glare. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. "We need to root them out completely," Jeremiah said, his voice grim. "No more shadows. We bring them into the light and end this." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "For the children who still suffer, for those we've lost, we fight until the last ember of this darkness is extinguished." The next weeks were a whirlwind of action. We sent riders across the territories, uncovering cult cells disguised as churches, orphanages, and community halls. Each raid was a test of nerve and skill, a dance between life and death played out beneath the harsh desert sun. The cult's tactics grew more sinister. They used threats, blackmail, and even murder to silence those who opposed them. But with every strike, our resolve hardened. One evening, word came of a gathering, a secret meeting of the cult's leaders deep within the ruins of an ancient pueblo, nestled in a forgotten canyon. It was our chance to cut off the head of the serpent once and for all. The operation was perilous. We moved at night, under a new moon, the silence broken only by the soft hoofbeats of our horses and the whispering wind through the rocks. As we approached the ruins, torches flickered against the stone, shadows dancing like ghosts. The cultists were gathered in prayer, their voices rising in a chilling chorus that echoed off the canyon walls. We struck swiftly, a thunderclap of gunfire and shouting. The battle was fierce and brutal. Men and women who once hid behind twisted faith now fought with desperation. In the chaos, Sarah confronted the new leader, a man as cold and merciless as Morse had been, but with a cunning that chilled me to the bone. Their clash was both physical and spiritual, a battle of wills that seemed to shake the very earth beneath us. When the dust settled, the cult's leadership lay broken, their network shattered. The remaining followers fled into the desert, leaderless and scattered. Back at the ranch, as dawn crept over the horizon, we counted our blessings and mourned our losses. The fight had taken much, but it had given us more, the strength to stand, the courage to endure. Sarah stood beside me, the first rays of sunlight warming her face. "This is our home now," she said softly. "And we'll protect it, no matter the cost." I nodded, feeling the weight of the desert settle around us like a cloak. The battle was won, but the war for our souls, for the souls of those children, was just beginning. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but beneath its endless sky, we had found something worth fighting for: hope, redemption, and the unbreakable bond of those who refused to be broken. The desert sun climbed high above the horizon, blazing a ruthless path across the vast expanse that stretched in every direction, unforgiving and merciless. The ranch, once a quiet refuge amid the barren wilderness, had transformed into a battleground scarred by the weight of what we'd endured and the battles still to come. The remnants of the cult that had haunted our lives for so long were scattered, but not defeated. They had slipped through our fingers like shadows cast by the flickering firelight, ever present, always lurking just beyond reach. Their whispers spread like wildfire, sowing fear in small towns and dusty outposts, turning neighbors against neighbors, poisoning the very soil beneath our feet. Sarah had become more than just a survivor. She was a leader, a guiding light for the children and the people who had come to trust her strength. But behind her determined gaze was a storm of pain and memories, a silence that only she could hear. The nights were the hardest, for all of us. The nightmares clawed at the edges of our minds, relentless reminders of the horrors we'd seen. The law had stepped in, but justice was a slow and crooked road in these parts. Trials and verdicts were just words on paper for many, swallowed by the vast emptiness that often felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. One morning, Jeremiah returned from a scouting mission with news that tightened the knot in my stomach. "They're regrouping again," he said, voice low. "But this time, they're smarter. Hiding in plain sight, blending in with townsfolk, wearing the faces of farmers, merchants, even preachers." The ranch fell silent. The fight we thought was nearing its end was just beginning a new, deadlier phase. Sarah gathered the council beneath the broad sky, the horizon burning orange with the setting sun. "We cannot win this by force alone," she said. "They've learned to hide behind the very people we're trying to protect." Her words settled over us like a weight. We needed a new plan, one that didn't just rely on guns and grit, but on cunning and patience. We began to build a network, eyes and ears planted in towns and villages, people willing to risk everything to expose the cult's insidious roots. The work was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. Every tip we chased led us deeper into the labyrinth of lies and faith twisted into chains. One evening, as I sat by the fire nursing an old wound that still throbbed with every heartbeat, Sarah approached with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a collection of letters and maps, evidence gathered by our informants, revealing a web of locations tied to the cult's new operations. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, met mine. "We have to strike at the heart," she said. "Cut off the head of this snake once and for all." The plan was audacious, a coordinated attack on multiple locations simultaneously, stretching the cult's forces thin and exposing their weaknesses. The nights that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. We moved like ghosts across the desert, striking under cover of darkness, freeing prisoners, dismantling operations, and cutting the cult's reach one limb at a time. But the cult fought back with a ferocity born of desperation. Ambushes and traps awaited us, turning the desert into a maze of danger. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah's strength shone brightest. She led from the front, her courage a beacon that inspired us all. One fateful night, as we approached the largest of the cult's compounds, a sprawling, fortified ranch hidden in a canyon, our forces were ambushed. Gunfire erupted in the stillness, and the desert echoed with the cries of battle. I found myself separated from the others, trapped in the labyrinth of rock and shadow. My breath came hard, every muscle screaming as I fought through the maze. Suddenly, a figure appeared, Sarah. Her eyes were fierce, her presence a lifeline in the darkness. Together, we fought our way through, rescuing the last of the children and tearing down the cult's final stronghold. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the ranch lay silent once more, freed from the shadows that had haunted it for so long. Exhausted but alive, we gathered the children and survivors beneath the open sky, their laughter tentative but real. Sarah stood beside me, the carved lamb bone pendant glinting in the morning light. "We've won," she whispered. But in the desert, victory was never final. It was a moment, precious and fleeting, in a long battle for light to conquer darkness. And as the sun rose higher, casting its relentless gaze across the land, I knew this was only the beginning of a new dawn. The desert's heat bore down on us like a relentless hammer, and the sun had yet to reach its zenith when we found ourselves standing on the edge of what felt like the final chapter in this long, brutal saga. The ranch had become a beacon of hope for the broken and the lost, but the shadows that clung to the desert winds refused to lift completely. Despite the victories, the scars on all of us, both visible and hidden, were a reminder that the battle had exacted a heavy toll. Sarah, now a pillar of strength among the survivors, had grown into a fierce leader, her quiet determination carving a path through the darkness. But even her steady hands trembled in moments of solitude, the memories of captivity and pain etched into her every breath. Each night, when the campfires dimmed and the children slept, she wrestled with ghosts that no prayer could banish. Our intelligence had uncovered disturbing news, a resurgence of the cult, not in their old forms, but as an underground network, spreading like a plague beneath the very towns and homesteads we had once called safe. Their methods had evolved, no longer merely chaining children in physical captivity, but binding them in invisible chains of fear, manipulation, and false salvation. Jeremiah and I convened with our closest allies beneath the vast expanse of the desert sky, mapping out a desperate plan. We needed more than just brute force. We needed allies, information, and a way to cut the roots of this malignant tree before it strangled the land entirely. Sarah's voice, steady and sure, rose above the murmurs. "We strike at their heart, but we do so with precision, not reckless fury. We dismantle their network, one link at a time." Days bled into weeks as our small army moved like phantoms across the harsh landscape. We infiltrated town after town, unearthing hidden cells, freeing the children, and exposing the cult's twisted gospel for what it truly was, a cage forged by madness and cruelty. The cultists' desperation grew palpable. Ambushes became more frequent, traps more lethal. The desert itself seemed to conspire against us, its endless sand hiding dangers both natural and human-made. One night, as the moon cast ghostly light over the jagged canyon walls, we prepared for what we knew would be the most perilous assault yet. The cult's secret compound nestled deep within the cliffs, a fortress of stone and shadows, where the final captives were held. The air was thick with tension as we advanced silently, every footstep a whispered prayer. The compound loomed like a beast waiting to strike, its walls echoing with the faint cries of children, a haunting reminder of the stakes. The battle that erupted was savage and unrelenting. Gunfire tore through the night, mingling with screams and the thunder of horses' hooves. Cultists fought with a fanaticism born of terror, wielding faith as both weapon and shield. Sarah moved with a grace and ferocity that belied her years, her every action a promise to the children she fought to save. She was a whirlwind amid the chaos, tearing down walls and breaking chains, her voice steady even as the world around her burned. I found myself locked in a brutal confrontation with the cult's new leader, a man whose cold eyes mirrored the madness that had consumed his predecessors. His words were poison, dripping with the rhetoric of salvation twisted into menace. "You cannot stop God's will," he spat. But I saw through the lie. This was not divine purpose, but monstrous greed and cruelty masquerading as faith. Our fight was fierce, a clash of wills and bodies that left us both bloodied and breathless. When it ended, the compound lay in ruins, its power broken but not yet defeated. As dawn crept over the horizon, washing the desert in gold and fire, we gathered the children, their eyes wide with a fragile hope, and led them away from the darkness that had nearly swallowed them whole. Exhausted but unbowed, Sarah stood beside me, the carved lamb bone pendant glinting softly against her chest. "This is our home," she said quietly, "and we'll protect it, whatever the cost." The desert, harsh and unforgiving, had tested us in every way. But beneath its vast sky, we had forged something unbreakable: hope, resilience, and the fierce bonds of those who refused to be broken. Our fight was far from over, but as the sun rose higher, I knew that together, we could face whatever shadows still lingered. For even in the darkest night, the smallest light can shine like a beacon. The desert's unforgiving sun had barely risen when I felt the weight of the coming storm. Not just in the sky above, but in the very air around us. The ranch, once a sanctuary, now buzzed with quiet tension. We had struck deep into the cult's veins, shattering their strongholds and freeing their captives, but the fight had left scars wider than the canyons surrounding us. Every quiet moment was an echo of the violence and betrayal that had come before, every glance a reminder of what we'd lost and what still hung in the balance. Sarah had grown into her strength, her resilience a beacon to the other children, but the past clung to her like a second skin. Even as she laughed and played beneath the wide desert sky, her eyes held shadows that no time could easily erase. I often found her standing alone near the edge of the cliffs, gazing out toward the endless horizon as if searching for something lost in the dust. We knew the cult had been shattered, but whispers reached us, rumors of a final reckoning. Ezekiel Morse's name, though silenced in courts and prisons, still haunted the wind. His vision, warped and cruel, had seeded a hatred that no mere trial could kill. Our informants had uncovered plans, a gathering of the cult's remnants in a place steeped in ancient power, far from prying eyes. It was said to be a place where the lines between the mortal world and the spiritual blurred, a place where darkness might rise again if left unchecked. The council met under a sky bruised with the colors of twilight. Jeremiah's voice was grave as he laid out what we knew. This gathering is their last chance, to regroup, to reclaim what they lost. If they succeed, it'll be a disaster we can't undo. Sarah stood beside me, her hands clenched tightly, eyes burning with determination. We stopped them. No matter the cost. The plan was desperate. We'd move at night, under a moonless sky, through the jagged canyons and ancient ruins where silence was our only ally. Our small band of fighters was weary but unbroken, bound together by shared loss and a fierce hope. As we approached the site, the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. The ruins loomed before us, weathered stones etched with symbols older than memory, shadows pooling like spilled ink beneath the gnarled branches of ancient trees. The cultists were gathered in a circle, their voices chanting a terrible hymn that clawed at the soul. At their center stood a man cloaked in black, his face hidden beneath a hood, an echo of Morse himself. We struck with all the fury we had left. Gunfire shattered the night, mixing with screams and the crashing of stone. The fight was brutal, raw, a desperate battle of light against an ancient darkness. Sarah fought like a tempest, her every move a promise to the children still trapped in the nightmare. Her voice rang out, a rallying cry against the madness. The hooded figure confronted us, his words dripping with venomous faith. You cannot deny what is destined. This land belongs to the chosen. But we stood firm, knowing that their chosen were the lost and the broken, children whose innocence had been stolen and twisted. In the chaos, Sarah faced the figure alone, the carved lamb bone pendant shining like a beacon against the night. Their struggle was fierce, a clash not just of bodies but of wills and spirits. With a final, desperate cry, she shattered the man's hold, the cult's dark power breaking like a wave against the shore. The cultists scattered, their dreams of resurrection crumbling. As dawn bled into the sky, washing the desert in light, we gathered the survivors, children whose eyes now held the fragile hope of freedom. Sarah stood beside me, her smile small but real, the desert wind lifting strands of her hair. "We did it," she whispered. But I knew this was more than a victory. It was a beginning, a chance to heal, to build, to protect the future from the darkness of the past. The desert had tested us all, but beneath its endless sky, we had forged a new story, one of survival, of courage, and of the unbreakable bonds that tie us to each other. And as the sun climbed higher, I felt a deep peace settle over us. The shadows had been chased away, and for the first time in a long while, the horizon seemed filled with promise. The desert air was crisp with the promise of dawn, yet the weight of everything we'd endured pressed heavy on my chest. The night's battle had left the earth scarred, the silence afterward ringing louder than any gunfire. Around us, the survivors, children with eyes wide open now, no longer haunted but wary, were slowly gathering strength. Some huddled close to Sarah, whose small frame had grown into something fierce, something unyielding. I looked at her, standing tall beneath the vast, endless sky that stretched like a canvas painted with blood and hope. The carved lamb bone pendant hung heavy around her neck, a symbol that had morphed from a token of torment into a beacon of salvation. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a guardian, a living testament to the power of resilience. The last remnant of the cult lay broken, scattered like dust in the wind. Ezekiel Morse's twisted gospel had been drowned beneath the roar of our defiance. Yet the scars, the invisible ones, etched into every soul here reminded me that some battles were never truly over. We had stopped their dark plans, but the echoes would linger. We moved with purpose now, gathering the children and the weary into the shelter of the ranch, the place that had once been just a home but had become a fortress of hope. The sun's first rays spilled over the red canyon walls, igniting the desert in a blaze of gold. It was a new day, a clean slate carved out of blood and fire. Sarah knelt beside a small boy whose eyes reflected a mix of terror and wonder. She reached out, her fingers brushing the boy's cheek with a tenderness born of shared pain. "You're safe now," she whispered. "We'll keep you safe." I felt a surge of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Hope. For the children, for the land, for the future. But the desert had taught me that peace was earned, never given. That darkness always waits just beyond the horizon. Still, today was ours. Later, as the camp settled into a quiet hum, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sun climb higher. Sarah joined me, settling beside me with a tired smile. "Do you ever think about the past?" she asked softly. "Every day," I replied. "But the past doesn't define us. It's what we do now that counts." She nodded, her eyes bright despite everything. "We'll rebuild. Together." Together, the word carried a weight of promise heavier than any bullet. We were no longer just survivors. We were family. Guardians of a future forged in the harshest desert, hardened by the cruelties we'd witnessed, but softened by the bonds we'd built. The children laughed for the first time in months, their voices ringing out like music across the open plains. And in their laughter, I heard the desert's true song, a hymn of survival, of renewal, of unbreakable spirit. The long night was over. As the sun rose fully, casting light on the barren earth that had witnessed so much suffering, it also shone on a new dawn, a dawn where fear no longer held dominion, where faith was reclaimed from darkness, and where hope, fragile but fierce, bloomed eternal. The desert had taken much from us, but it had also given us something stronger, the will to fight, to protect, and to heal. And as I stood there, with Sarah by my side and the children safe within our embrace, I knew one truth above all else. No matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. And this time, it was ours to keep. If you were in his shoes, Would you have fought the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on screen for more unforgettable stories.